Picture a woman standing at her front door, keys already in hand, coat already on, ready to leave for a dinner she's been looking forward to all week. The phone rings. It's her sister. Within 4 minutes, the coat is off, the keys are back on the hook, and she's agreed to spend her evening doing something she never wanted to do, something she'll resent by 9 o'clock. Nobody held a gun to her head. Nobody even raised their voice. And yet somehow her entire evening just changed hands. Here's the real question. Who was actually driving that decision? That's exactly the question Jacques Regard, the French psychologist, spends his entire book answering. Don't be a puppet in the hands of others. And his answer starts with an image so simple you'll never forget it once you hear it. Stay with me. This one changes how you notice things. A simple truth to start. No sane driver would ever hand the steering wheel to a passenger and let them decide where the car goes. And yet, Regard points out, that's exactly what happens every single time we let someone control us. Someone uses pressure, guilt, charm, or manipulation, and we quietly hand over the wheel of our own evening, our own decision, our own life, without ever noticing the handoff happened. Here's the plain truth underneath that image. Being controlled by other people is not fate. It is not destiny. It is not some law of how relationships have to work. It is a series of small, specific handoffs, and every single one of them can be refused. Eleanor Roosevelt put a version of this in 9 words that have outlived her by decades. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. Swap inferior for controlled, and you have Regard's entire thesis in a single sentence. The 3 faces of control. Regard makes a distinction that turns out to matter enormously, because not every act of influence in your life is actually a problem. He identifies 3 types of control, sorted by the intention behind them. The first type is control with good intent. This is the parent insisting a child wear a coat in winter, the friend who nags you to see a doctor about that cough. The controller's aim is genuinely your well-being, even if the method feels a little heavy-handed. This kind of control, Regard is careful to say, isn't the enemy here. The second type is self-centered control. The controller isn't trying to hurt you. They're just entirely focused on their own comfort, their own convenience, their own needs, with no real thought given to what it costs you. The sister on the phone, more often than not, falls into this category. She's not plotting against you. She's just never once considered that her need for company outweighs your need for your own evening. The third type is malicious control. Here, the controller knows exactly what they're doing, and the goal is deliberately to dominate, to diminish, to extract something from you at your expense, fully aware of the cost to you. This is the smallest category in practice, but it's the one people fear the most, and fear of it often makes them mistake ordinary self-centered control for something sinister it isn't. Why does this distinction matter so much? Because your response should be different for each one. Good intent control usually just needs a conversation. Self-centered control needs a boundary. Malicious control needs distance, sometimes real distance. Treating all 3 the same way, either giving in every time or going to war every time, is exactly how people either stay stuck being controlled or burn bridges with people who never actually meant them harm. Why we hand over the wheel. Here's where Regard gets genuinely useful, because he doesn't stop at describing controllers. He turns the lens around and asks, why do some of us hand over the wheel so easily in the first place? His answer, backed by decades of clinical observation, comes down to 2 things more than any other: excessive kindness and a habit of quietly ignoring your own rights. Not because these people are weak, often the opposite. The people who get controlled most easily are frequently the most conscientious people in the room, the ones who feel a flash of guilt at the mere thought of disappointing someone, the ones who were taught early that being good means being agreeable. There's a story, widely told about Mahatma Gandhi, of a mother who traveled a great distance with her son to ask Gandhi to tell the boy to stop eating sugar, which was harming his health. Gandhi asked her to come back in 2 weeks. Confused, she made the long journey again. This time, Gandhi simply told the boy to stop eating sugar. When the mother asked why he hadn't just said it the first time, Gandhi reportedly replied that 2 weeks earlier, he himself hadn't yet stopped eating sugar, and he couldn't ask of the boy what he hadn't first asked of himself. Whether or not every detail of that story is exactly accurate, the principle inside it applies directly here. You cannot ask others to respect a boundary you haven't first decided to respect yourself. The manipulative colleague, the demanding friend, the relative who borrows and never returns, none of them installed your discomfort with saying no. That discomfort was there long before they showed up. They just learned, consciously or not, exactly how to find it. Portraits of the Controller ***. Regard walks through recognizable, everyday portraits of people who take the wheel from us, and it's worth sitting with a few of them, because they rarely look the way we expect a controller to look. The colleague who quietly takes over a project, or a role that was rightfully yours, moving in so gradually that by the time you notice, the takeover already feels like the established order of things. The friend who treats everything you do for them as small, unremarkable, never quite enough, so that you find yourself doing more and more, chasing an acknowledgement that never actually arrives. The person who, after every single conversation, leaves you feeling drained, deflated, slightly smaller than you were an hour ago, without you being able to point to any one specific thing they said. And the borrower, the one who takes your tools, your books, your money, with total confidence and simply never gives them back, treating your hesitation to ask for them as the awkward part, rather than their failure to return them. What these portraits share is subtlety. None of them involve shouting or obvious cruelty. That's precisely what makes them effective, and precisely why so many of us don't notice we've been controlled until years, sometimes decades, have gone by. The mechanism, how control actually works. Regard breaks down the actual mechanics controllers rely on, and once you see them named, they become far harder to fall for. The first mechanism is what he calls paralyzing methods. This is the well-timed guilt trip, the sigh. The "after everything I've done for you," deployed at exactly the moment you might otherwise say no. Its entire function is to freeze your reaction before it forms, so that agreement feels like the only path of least resistance. The second is misleading methods. This is reframing the request so it no longer looks like a request at all. "You're the only one I can ask. It'll just take 5 minutes. Anyone reasonable would say yes to this." Each phrase quietly relocates the burden of the decision from the controller onto you, so that refusing starts to feel unreasonable, even cruel, even though nothing about the actual situation has changed. The philosopher and writer C.S. Lewis observed that of all tyrannies, the one exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive, precisely because it comes wrapped in a claim of good intent. That insight cuts right to the heart of why self-centered and even good intent control can be so hard to resist. It rarely arrives labeled as control. It arrives labeled as love, as friendship, as family, as a small favor between people who care about each other. Recognizing the moment, the wheel changes hands. Here's a practical tool Regard offers, and it's disarmingly simple. Learn to notice the exact physical sensation that shows up in the instant someone starts to take the wheel from you. For most people, it's a specific, recognizable feeling, a tightening in the chest, a flush of guilt, an urge to speak quickly and agree before the discomfort gets any worse. That sensation is data. It's not a coincidence, and it's not simply who you are. It's the signal that a handoff is happening right now, in real time, and it's the single best moment to intervene, because once the agreement is out of your mouth, revering it becomes far harder, both practically and emotionally. The next time that sensation shows up, mid-conversation, Regard's advice is almost absurdly simple, and that simplicity is exactly its strength. Buy time. Let me think about it and get back to you. Nothing more elaborate is required. Controllers of every type rely heavily on speed, on getting a yes before you've had a real chance to consult your own judgment. Removing the time pressure removes most of their leverage in a single move. Saying no without a war. The instinct many people have, once they finally recognize they've been controlled for years, is to swing hard in the opposite direction. Refuse everything, apologize for nothing, treat every request as a potential trap. Regard is careful to steer away from this, because it usually just trades one problem for another, and it tends to hit good intent controllers, the people who genuinely love you, hardest of all. His actual recommendation is a technique sometimes called the broken record. State your position calmly, briefly, and repeat it, without escalating, without over-explaining, without matching the other person's emotional intensity. I understand you need help, but I can't this weekend. If pressed, I hear that and I still can't this weekend. No new arguments are required with each repetition. The refusal doesn't need to grow more elaborate just because the pressure does. There's a well-known account of Rosa Parks, who, when asked decades later why she didn't give up her seat on that Montgomery bus, said simply that she was tired of giving in. Her refusal that day was quiet. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a scene. It was one calm, repeated position, held steady against enormous pressure to reverse it. That's the broken record technique, playing out at the scale of history rather than at the scale of a phone call from a sister. But the mechanism is identical. State it plainly, hold it steadily, and let the other person's pressure exhaust itself against something that doesn't move. Full example start to finish. Let's put these pieces together with one complete scene, the way Regard's book itself likes to do. Picture a coworker who stops by your desk on a Thursday afternoon. Hey, I know this is last minute, but could you cover my shift on Saturday? You're honestly the only one I trust with this account. Notice the mechanism already at work. The flattery, the implied compliment wrapped around the request, designed to make refusal feel like a betrayal of trust rather than a simple boundary. First, notice the sensation. That small tightening, that urge to say yes immediately just to make the discomfort go away. That's your signal. Second, by time. Let me check my weekend and get back to you in an hour. This single sentence on its own already breaks most of the pressure because it removes the live, in-person urgency the request depended on. Third, decide with a clear head, away from the moment. Is this good intent control, a colleague genuinely stuck and asking sincerely? Self-centered control, someone who consistently offloads inconvenient shifts onto whoever hesitates the least. Or something closer to malicious, someone who specifically targets you because they've learned you're the one who always says yes. The right response depends entirely on which one this actually is. Fourth, if the answer is no, deliver it as a broken record. I've thought about it, and I can't cover Saturday. If they push, I understand it's frustrating, but I can't cover Saturday. No lengthy justification required because a genuine no doesn't need a defense to be valid. Notice what didn't happen in that scene. No fight. No guilt spiral. No 3-day resentment simmering afterward. Just one clean, calm refusal delivered from a place where you'd actually had time to think, instead of reacting from that first tightening in your chest. Why some people never get targeted. Here's a detail Regard spends real time on, and it's worth pulling out on its own because it flips the usual framing on its head. We tend to ask, how do I stop controllers from targeting me? As if controllers were a fixed, external force scanning the room for victims. Regard's observation is more useful and slightly less comfortable. Controllers, of the self-centered and malicious varieties, are remarkably good at reading a room and identifying, often within minutes of meeting someone, who is likely to say yes with the least resistance. This isn't mystical. It's pattern recognition, the same kind any of us do unconsciously in 100 other contexts. Someone who apologizes reflexively, who fills silences nervously, who agrees quickly to avoid tension, is broadcasting information, whether they intend to or not. And people who rely on control for their comfort or advantage have had a great deal of practice reading exactly that broadcast. The useful flip side of this is that the signal can change. Regard notes that the same people who are targeted repeatedly by controllers in one period of their life often report, once they've built the habits this book describes, being approached far less often with these kinds of demands, not because the controllers around them vanished, but because the visible signal that made them an easy target quietly disappeared. This is, in a sense, the most hopeful part of the whole framework. This isn't a fixed trait you're stuck with. It's a pattern you were trained into, and patterns you were trained into can be retrained. The cost of staying silent. It's worth pausing on something the book treats seriously, but that's easy to rush past. The actual cost of these small, repeated handoffs, compounded over years. Regard describes what happens, clinically, to people who spend a decade or more consistently handing over the wheel. It isn't usually a single dramatic breakdown. It's a slow accumulation, a growing resentment that has no clear target because no single incident was bad enough to justify it, a creeping sense of exhaustion that doesn't match up with how objectively reasonable each individual request seemed at the time, and often, eventually, a kind of quiet withdrawal from relationships altogether, simply because staying available to people has started to feel unsafe. Nelson Mandela, reflecting on decades spent negotiating with people who held every form of power over him, wrote that he learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not the one who does not feel afraid, but the one who conquers that fear. The fear Regard is describing here is smaller in scale, obviously, than what Mandela lived through, but it operates through the exact same mechanism. The felt sense of danger in disappointing someone is nearly always larger than the actual consequence of doing so. Most people who finally say no to a chronic controller discover, almost without exception, that the imagined catastrophe never actually arrives. A practical exercise for this week. If you want a concrete way to start applying this immediately, here's a simplified version of an exercise Regard's book builds toward across its 3 sections. For the next 7 days, every time you agree to something, pause for 3 seconds before answering, even if you already know you'll say yes. In that pause, silently ask yourself just one question. Am I agreeing to this because I actually want to, or because saying no felt harder in this moment than saying yes? You're not required to change your answer. You're just gathering information. By the end of the week, you'll likely notice a pattern. Certain people, certain phrases, certain types of requests that consistently pull a yes out of you before you've actually decided anything. That pattern is your personal blueprint, the specific shape of the wheel you tend to hand over, and other people's specific shape of a request that reliably gets it from you. Once you can see the pattern in writing, it becomes dramatically easier to catch it happening in real time, rather than only recognizing it afterward in hindsight, once the evening is already gone. Malicious control, a different category entirely. It's worth spending a little more time on the third category Regard names, because it's the one that requires a genuinely different response than the other two, and conflating it with the others is where a lot of well-meaning advice goes wrong. Malicious control isn't just intense self-centered control. The distinguishing feature is awareness. The controller knows the cost to you and proceeds anyway, sometimes because inflicting that cost is itself part of what they want. This shows up as the partner who deliberately isolates someone from friends and family under the guise of love, the manager who takes credit for a subordinate's work, while making sure that subordinate never gets close enough to others in the organization to correct the record, the family member who specifically brings up old wounds at gatherings, because watching the reaction is, in some way, satisfying to them. George Simon, the American psychologist who wrote extensively on manipulative personalities, made a distinction that maps closely onto Regard's third category. The most effective manipulators are rarely dramatic or obviously hostile. They're often charming, socially skilled, and genuinely well-liked by everyone who hasn't yet been on the receiving end of their manipulation. That charm isn't incidental. It's precisely what makes the malicious controller's behavior so hard for others to believe when the target finally tries to describe it. The broken record technique, useful as it is against self-centered control, is often insufficient here, because a malicious controller isn't simply testing your resolve out of habit. They're actively probing for the specific angle that will work. Regard's guidance shifts accordingly for this category. Document the pattern, involve people outside the relationship who can see it clearly, and treat distance, sometimes significant distance, as a legitimate and often necessary response, not a failure of patience or a sign you didn't try hard enough. When the controller is family asterisk. One context Regard returns to more than once, because readers ask about it more than any other, is what happens when the person taking the wheel is a parent, a sibling, or another close family member, where the techniques above suddenly feel much harder to apply cleanly. Part of the difficulty is structural. With a colleague or a casual friend, the relationship itself has a natural exit if a boundary isn't respected. With family, decades of shared history, obligation, and identity are wrapped around every single interaction. So a boundary that would be simple with a stranger can feel, with a parent, like a threat to the entire relationship. Regard's advice here is more modest than his advice for other relationships, and deliberately so. Don't expect the broken record technique to instantly resolve a pattern that took decades to form. Instead, aim for small, consistent shifts, holding one specific boundary steadily over months, rather than trying to renegotiate the entire relationship in a single conversation. The goal with family control is rarely a clean, permanent fix. It's a gradual recalibration of what the other person has come to expect from you, one repeated, unremarkable instance at a time. Now let's be honest. Every book like this deserves an honest accounting in return, and here it is. Regard's framework works cleanly in the kind of controlled, single interaction examples his book relies on: a colleague, a friend, a phone call. Real relationships, especially long-term ones like marriages, family ties, or decades-old friendships, are considerably messier. The people who control us there are frequently also the people who love us, support us, and show up for us in 100 other ways. Applying a clean technique like the broken record to your own mother, after 30 years of a specific relational pattern between you, is a far more delicate operation than the book's tidy dialogue examples suggest, and it can carry real relational cost that a workplace refusal simply doesn't. There's a second limitation worth nomming plainly. The book, understandably, focuses almost entirely on the controlled person's responsibility to notice the pattern and respond differently. But in cases of genuinely malicious control, and especially in situations involving real power imbalances, an abusive partner, a coercive employer, the burden of fixing the dynamic cannot reasonably sit entirely on the person being controlled. Recognizing your own tendency toward excessive kindness is genuinely useful information. It is not, on its own, a complete solution to being targeted by someone acting in bad faith, and treating it as one risks quietly shifting responsibility onto the person with less power in the relationship. Even with those limits acknowledged, the book's central contribution holds up well. Most of the daily erosion of our autonomy doesn't come from dramatic villains. It comes from small, repeated handoffs we've stopped noticing, and noticing them again, consistently, really is most of the work. The takeaway: what to actually carry with you. So let's strip away the terminology and see what's left, in plain terms. First, not all influence is control, and not all control is malicious. Sort what's actually happening to you into good intent, self-centered, or malicious before deciding how hard to push back, because the right response is different for each. Second, learn your own specific physical signal, that tightening, that flush of guilt, and treat it as data the instant it shows up, not as a character flaw to be ashamed of. Third, buy time before you answer. "Let me think about it" is, on its own, one of the most powerful sentences available to you because it removes the urgency almost every controller is quietly counting on. Fourth, and this is the one worth sitting with, a calm refusal, repeated steadily, doesn't need a longer justification each time someone pushes back. The strength of a boundary comes from its consistency, not from the size of the argument defending it. No one hands you back the wheel of your own life. You take it back, one small, deliberate refusal at a time. And the driver's seat, it turns out, was always yours. You just have to remember to sit back down in it.